All right, so today we are diving into a topic that honestly can be kind of tough to talk about, but it's one of those things that's as so important to understand, workplace bullying. And specifically, we're digging into this manuscript someone sent our way, Tackling Workplace Bullying by Rick Caniglia.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, just reading through it,
Yeah.
you can tell this is something the author's dealt with personally. Like, he's passionate, but there's this edge to it, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It's like you can almost hear it in his voice, even
Yeah.
just from the introduction.
Mhm.
You get the sense he's seen this firsthand, the impact it can have.
Exactly. So let's unpack this a bit. Right away, Caniglia, he jumps into all the different forms bullying can take. And it's not always the stuff we might, picture right off the bat.
No, not at all.
It's more than just, yelling or getting physical.
He goes beyond those obvious ones. Like, he talks about psychological bullying and cyberbullying, which honestly can be even harder to, put your finger on.
And harder to prove, I bet.
Exactly. And because it's harder to prove, it can be harder to, get people to take it seriously.
It's like he's saying bullying isn't just about a black eye or a nasty comment. It's any behavior that's meant to, undermine someone, isolate them, but over time, it's a pattern.
And that's where understanding the Australian laws, the whole legal side of things, it becomes really important, which thankfully, Caniglia, he lays it out pretty clearly.
Yeah, he specifically mentions that Fair Work Act, the one from back in 2009.
Right. And that whole thing about repeated unreasonable behavior, which that's a pretty key phrase in all this.
So for those of us who haven't memorized the Fair Work Act, can you break that down? What does repeated unreasonable behavior actually mean? Like, how would you know if it was happening?
Basically, it boils down to, well, a pattern of conduct that a reasonable person looking at the situation would say, yeah, that's not okay. Humiliating someone, intimidating them, even if it's not outright threats, but creating that kind of environment.
Okay, so it's got to be more than just a one-time thing. It's got to be ongoing.
Exactly. It's a pattern, not just an isolated incident. And it's got to be serious enough to have a real impact on the person's well-being, their ability to do their job.
Which is where I guess work cover comes in, right? It's not just for physical injuries these days.
Exactly. Work cover now covers psychological injuries that come from workplace bullying, which that's a big deal.
Huge. Because like we were saying, this stuff can really mess you up mentally.
No question. It can have long-lasting effects, even if you don't see any physical scars. It can impact your self-esteem, your relationships, everything.
Okay, so that all makes sense. But then Caniglia, he gets kind of cynical about those work cover settlements. Almost like he's hinting that they can be used to silence victims,
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that he's a little wary of how those settlements sometimes play out.
Like, instead of the organization actually having to make changes, they just throw money at the problem and it all goes away, right?
It's a valid concern for sure.
Because then they don't have to admit they did anything wrong.
Just like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Right.
Might make it look better on the surface, but doesn't actually fix the underlying issue.
So it's like, okay, the individual might get some help, but what about everyone else? What about stopping this stuff from happening in the first place?
Yeah.
And thankfully, Caniglia doesn't leave us hanging. He gets into what individuals can do, to protect themselves.
Yeah, and for Caniglia, it all starts with documentation. Like, seriously, he hammers this point home.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's like every other page he's saying document everything.
I think at one point he even puts it in bold.
I wouldn't be surprised. It's almost like he's, shouting it from the rooftops. Pay attention, people. This is important. But joking aside, I get it. In a he said, she said situation, having that paper trail.
It's crucial. Dates, times, who witnessed it.
Even stuff that seemed small at the time.
Exactly, because what might seem insignificant in the moment could become part of a bigger pattern later on. He even talks about forwarding work emails to your personal account, making copies of documents, just in case.
So you've got your own records no matter what. Smart.
Right, because if you ever need to take action, whether it's going through the Fair Work Commission.
Which, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, that's kind of like Australia's big workplace court system, right?
Exactly. So whether it's going through them or even, taking legal action some other way, you need that proof.
It's like being your own best advocate, unfortunately.
And while that's all about what to do, IF bullying happens, Caniglia, he's also big on prevention. Like, how do we make workplaces where this stuff is less likely to happen in the first place?
Okay, so getting to the root of it. I like that.
And a big part of that, he says, is open communication. Like creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up.
Which easier said than done in some workplaces.
Oh, for sure. And that's why he talks about training, too.
Yeah.
And not just for managers, but for everyone.
Training on what exactly?
On what bullying actually is. Because sometimes people don't even realize they're doing it, you
Yeah.
know? And then how to address it if you see it happening.
Okay, so it's about everyone taking responsibility, not just leaving it to the person being bullied to fix it.
Exactly. It's a collective effort to create that respectful environment.
Yeah.
And it's about recognizing that, sometimes staying silent, that can be part of the problem too.
Right, like if you see something, say something.
He actually uses the term bystander intervention, which I thought was interesting. Like, even if you're not the target, you can still play a role in stopping it.
So we've talked about what individuals can do, but there's this whole other layer to this, right? And it kind of goes back to that thing we were saying before about work cover.
Yeah, how sometimes it seems like those settlements, even though they're meant to help the victim, it's almost like they end up protecting the organization more.
Exactly. And Caniglia, he kind of wrestles with that in the manuscript.
It's tricky, for sure. Because, nobody's saying work cover is a BD thing. It can be a lifeline for people who need, like, financial help or time off to recover, but...
But it can't just be about sweeping the problem under the rug either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where those no-fault settlements, they get a little murky. Because, yeah, the organization pays up, but...
Yeah. But they never have to actually admit they did anything wrong.
And often, those settlements come with confidentiality agreements. So the victim's not really allowed to talk about what happened.
Which, okay, in some cases that might make sense.
But it also makes it really hard to get a handle on how big the problem really is.
And if nobody knows about it, how can you stop it from happening again to someone else?
Right. And it puts the victim in a tough spot, too. On the one hand, you might desperately need that settlement money, the support.
But then you also might feel like you're being silenced, like, is this really justice?
Exactly. It's a tough call, and honestly, Caniglia doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He's not saying there's one right way to handle it.
So what's the takeaway then? What does he want us to do with all this?
I think the big thing is he wants people to be informed. Like, really understand their rights. Maybe even talk to a lawyer. Get independent advice before signing anything.
Don't feel pressured. Right. Whether it's a settlement or even just reporting the bullying in the first place.
Exactly. Because ultimately, it's about the individual feeling empowered to make the choice that's right for them, not just for the organization.
And bigger picture, it goes back to what we were saying before about creating those workplaces where bullying isn't tolerated in the first place.
Right. Prevention over reaction.
Yeah.
Where everyone feels safe, respected.
Like that should be the bare minimum, shouldn't it? Feeling safe at work.
Absolutely. And if we see something happening, we don't just look the other way.
We speak up.
Exactly. Because even if we're not the ones being targeted, we can still be allies. And that's how we start to create real change.
This has been, wow, quite the deep dive. We've covered a lot of text. But the important thing is we're talking about it, bringing it out into the open.
Because knowledge is power, right?
100%. The more we know about this, the better equipped we are to deal with it, whether it's happening to us or to someone we know. So thank you, Ari, for joining us for this conversation. And please keep the conversation going. Talk to your friends, your family, your coworkers. Let's create workplaces where everyone feels safe and respected.